Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome again to all those who have come back to your alma mater. And may I say, you have chosen a particularly suitable day for your visit, despite the weather, because today's feast is held in anticipation of the 450th anniversary of the College Foundation. However, there is another anniversary that we can celebrate right today. To quote from one 17th century text, on Friday being the 22nd of September, anno 1592, about 3 of the clock in the afternoon of the same day, the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty entered into the bounds or precincts of the University of Oxford. That's right. So, fantastic scheduling. Today it is exactly 426 years since Queen Elizabeth I visited Oxford. This was her second visit to the city, and it was to be her last. Sadly, there is no evidence that she entered this college, the only college founded during her reign in Oxford, as we have heard from Alex. However, we do know that she passed by the college because she walked from St. John's College down to Carfax. She stayed in Oxford for several days, enjoying a program of entertainment and also many orations, which allegedly have not always been short. One of the men preaching for Elizabeth was the Bishop Herbert Westphaling, who in fact was a benefactor of this college. And again, according to a contemporary account, quote, "His oration was so long that Her Majesty was somewhat wearied therewith, as it was thought, and did therefore, without any speech of her own, return to her lodging." To make matters worse, just before leaving the city on the last day, she heard lastly a long, tedious oration made unto her by the junior proctor of the university about a mile from the city. Well, I just want to say that I hope that you will enjoy today's talks a bit more than she did. At the time of Elizabeth's second visit, she was 59. When she came to Oxford for the first time, she was 33. So that means that 26 years lie between these two historical visits. And in my talk, I'm going to explore what the passing of time actually meant for royal figures and how it was recorded and reflected upon in the century when this college was founded. Literature and the visual art constructed in various ways this royal image, the title of my talk. I'm going to focus on portraits, some of which can actually be seen at this college. We are going to explore how the portraits tackled the sensitive issue of royal age and aging. However, we shall also see that portraits could actually become a very distinct form of political commentary, reflecting on very difficult issues of, in the question of two competing dynasties. So, in my talk, first, I'm going to consider the development of royal portraiture from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And second, I will show how portraiture was used to propagate the triumph of the Tudor Dynasty over its predecessors, the Plantagenets. I will do this by comparing the representations of three iconic figures of these dynasties, Henry VII and Elizabeth on the Tudor side, and Richard III on the Plantagenet side. And we shall see that these examples really show very radically different implications of royal age. young age as a symbol of political promise, advanced age as a symbol of wisdom, and finally, fictional advanced age as a symbol of decay and governmental inaptitude. Our perception of the Tudor monarchs is indeed very visual, and for a very good reason. The Tudor rule in the 16th century coincided with an unprecedented development of art, and particularly portraits. Portraiture was propelled by the humanist emphasis on the secular rather than the divine. But this human-oriented focus also blended with the emergence of a modern state and its need for confident self-projection. And I think we can all see the difference between the medieval and early modern portrayals of the kings. On the left, you can see a late 14th century depiction of Richard II, which is often regarded as the earliest English state portrait. It draws on the tradition of religious iconography. The king seems distant, solemn, almost out of this world. And now let us compare that with the very earthly depiction of Henry VIII by Hans Holbein, which one scholar very memorably described as, quote, a gouty, pig-eyed pile of flesh, whose astounding girth is only emphasized by the layers of slashed velvets and furs that encase him. Well, what has happened in the portraiture from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance has been wonderfully captured by the art historian John Pope Hennessy. In one sense, the portrait in the Renaissance is no more than a watershed between the medieval portrait and the portrait as we know it now. Representationally, it is the story of how eyes cease to be the linear symbols and become instead the light-reflecting, light-perceiving organs we ourselves possess. How lips cease to be a segment in the undifferentiated texture of the face and become instead a sensitized area through whose relaxation or contraction a whole range of responses is expressed. How the nose ceases to be a fence between the two sides of the face and becomes instead the delicate instrument through which we breathe and smell. And how ears cease to be the repulsive Gothic polypi emerging from the head and become instead a kind of inbuilt receiving set whose divine functions compensate for its rather unattractive form. I think we can see through this summary how the artist's subjects were becoming more individualized and more personally recognizable. However, we should remember that it was not just the paintings which reflected this shift. A very similar development occurred also in the more immediately accessible art of coin portraiture. So what I have right here, something many of you might have in your pocket right now, I'm holding a contemporary £1 coin showing Elizabeth II. The general design, a realistic profile portrait, can actually be traced back to the change in design which was instigated by Henry VII. What he did was he replaced the generic image of a king with his own profile that was according to the European fashion. So in other words, the shift from a medieval style of representation to the Renaissance style can also look like this. On the left, we see the coin of Richard III, except that there is absolutely nothing that would tell you that this is actually Richard III as a person. And on the right, we can actually recognize Henry VII in his mature age. A king was replaced by the king. A greater degree of individualization is not the only difference between the portraits of these two kings. Visual art could also emphasize the difference between the two dynasties. As you all know, the Tudor dynasty emerged from the conflict of the Wars of the Roses. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And interestingly enough, Tudor artists were depicting their conflict as intra-generational as well as interdynastic. So in other words, Henry VII embodied all the promises of youth, vigor and virility, while Richard III came to epitomize elderliness, inaptitude and dynastic barrenness. And to be fair, this has remained possibly the most overlooked feature of the representation of Richard III, which I think is absolutely astonishing because there has been so much attention paid to the portraits of Richard III. In a way, we have been so focused on his alleged deformity, on his poetic hunch and his uneven shoulders, that we have failed to notice his wrinkles. And yet I think it is along these lines, as it were, that the personal and dynastic conflict between the two kings and the two dynasties was played out. Well, showing Richard as an elderly man was entirely a fabrication that was partly very carefully crafted as part of the Tudor visual mythology. Historically, Richard was 32 when he died at Bosworth. His opponent, Henry, was 28. So even by early modern standards, even by medieval standards, in fact, both men were at the prime of their strength and certainly not old. And the earliest portrait we have of Richard captures his age quite faithfully. This is from the Society of Antiquaries. So this comes from roughly 1520s. Now we can see how this depiction actually changed in the course of the 16th and the 17th century. I just should say that the following paintings have been cropped so that we can actually focus on Richard's face. I think this last picture illustrates really well how far the convention could go. Lines in Richard's face have grown deeper, while his sunken cheek and the very characteristic pointed chin seem as withered as his arm. You may recall the line in Shakespeare where Richard complains that nature sought to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub. And additionally, in this particular portrait, Richard's hair grows distinctly grey. The contrast between youth and old age comes up when we look at the dual representation of Richard and Henry. So, for example, this is a close-up on their faces from the Hornby Castle set, now found at the National Portrait Gallery. Richard was only 4 years older, as I said, and yet he looks distinctly more aged and tense. You can notice the lines in his face, which contrast with Henry's smoother skin. One could argue that portraiture had a remarkable capacity for a nuanced depiction, which is much harder to achieve in engravings and woodcuts. By nature, these techniques are based on amplifying the lines. And as a result, Richard's face in woodcuts and engravings became even more wrinkled. I think this woodcut from the early 17th century shows the extremity to which these depictions could go. And again, a comparison with Henry is a very important factor here. This particular engraving is imbued with ageist prejudice. Youthful and smiling Henry stands against the very elderly and sour Richard. The broken scepter in Richard's hand symbolizes governmental as well as physical impotence. Now, this is not to say that there are no depictions of Henry VII which would not show him in his advanced age. The contrary is true, in fact. The very first painting acquired by the National Portrait Gallery shows Henry before his death in his 50s. However, it is important to think that Henry and Richard, when they are depicted together, their age becomes a feature which sort of subliminally inspires us to see Henry as the more favorable one. Well, a natural question follows. If there is a distinct pattern in visual representation, did it also appear in literature? The answer is yes, but in less extreme forms. It is actually telling that Shakespeare depicts Henry as much younger than Richard. In the play called The Third Part of Henry VI, Henry Tudor is referred to as young Henry and a pretty lad, and Richard calls him a little peevish boy. And in his speech to his soldiers before the fatal battle, Richard highlights his own military experience while calling Henry a milksop, one that never in his life felt so much cold as over shoes in snow. Richard himself is never depicted as elderly in Shakespeare, but there are indications that the playwright imagined him as not exactly young. And this becomes clear from his mother's words, actually. And I'm going to show you a very brief scene from the film Richard III, which stars Ian McKellen and Maggie Smith. Just before the battle, the Duchess stops her son and she gives an account of his life. And I just want you to notice the different life stages that she actually identifies. So bear with me. Now I need to conquer technology.
Let me speak.
Be brief, dear mother, for I am in haste.
A grievous burden was your birth to me.
And came I not at last to comfort you?
You came on earth to make the earth my hell. Touchy and wayward was your infancy. Your school days, frightful, desperate, wild and furious. Your prime of manhood, daring, bold and venturous. Your age confirmed, proud, subtle, sly and bloody.
Basically, you could see in her account that she denounces his prime of manhood and his age confirmed as two separate life stages, which is really significant. According to contemporary understanding, Richard's age confirmed would place him somewhere in the late 40s, so again, well beyond the historical age of 32. Well, we have seen how advanced age could be manipulated as a tool for political purposes. And now let us move away from the artificial notion of youth and advanced age to the more specific, more physiologically grounded one. Time is objective in that it applies to everyone in the same measure. An hour is the same unit of time, whether you're a prince or a pauper. And it should be noted, however, that in our time, today, our time is different from the notion of time that existed in the Renaissance. Just look at this watch, which is one of the treasures of Jesus College, which allegedly belonged to King Charles I. There's some uncertainty. It probably belonged to him. The other option is it belonged to James I, but probably Charles. You will notice that it is different in one very important detail, because the dial does not have a hand to measure seconds. It was not until the invention of the pendulum clocks that seconds could be accurately measured. Well, with this technical and objective idea of time in mind, let us move from Richard's fictional aging to a real biological process. And let us focus on the person who did indeed grow old in front of the entire nation, our foundress, Queen Elizabeth. She ruled for 44 years, in the course of which portraits changed dramatically. Kind of an idea here. Her aging confirms the obvious truth. Royal bodies have never been private. A monarch's wrinkled skin becomes a scripted testimony of his or her political power and its inevitable demise. In the final years of Elizabeth's reign, the depictions of her age oscillated between very carefully navigated realism and allegorization, which veiled her wrinkles in agelessness, as it were. And sometimes the paintings did both. You can consider this one, known as the Ditchley Portrait. It depicts Gloriana in allegorical splendor. She stands on the map of England, symbolizing her unity with the land, and the very dramatic setting emphasizes the pathos and her implied power. However, we cannot fail to notice her aged features, her wrinkles and eyes that appear sunken deep in her face. So the combination of allegorization and a creeping age helps avoid the most difficult issue, that is Elizabeth's agelessness. Here, she transcends the boundaries of the realistic and the allegorical, of individual life stages, and of the expectations of natural procreation. Well, our college owns 3 paintings of Elizabeth, as well as a bust, and collectively they encompass a very wide spectrum of the depictions of the Queen. I must say that I'm particularly intrigued by this painting, which hangs in the Peter North Room, formerly known as the Old Bursary. And that's also the painting which you would have seen on your invitations. It dates back to the year 1590, when Elizabeth was 57. So in fact, it is dated 2 years before her final visit to Oxford. I will say that I've always felt certain shyness and uneasiness hidden behind the strokes of the brush. She wears a splendid gown, and she is not really as visibly aged as the Ditchley Portrait, and there is a noticeable blush that crosses her cheeks. And yet, her narrow pointed face and dark eyes contrast with the bright red cherries in her ear. This is the work of a painter who was looking for a middle ground between allegorization and realism. And let us just remember that the Queen was growing old at the same time when the portraits of Richard III were acquiring their elderly features. So if you imagine, if the Tudor arch-opponent was being depicted as elderly as a sign of his governmental ineptitude, would it take that long for the people to realize that these were the very same signs of old age, the same wrinkles and the same thinness which Elizabeth also displayed? But it is easy to fall prey to the stereotype that a monarch's age indicates only weakness, and the efforts to mask this age are just vain and futile. It is true that painters felt compelled to amend the Queen's portraits, often actually at the direct request of the Privy Council. But we also have first-hand accounts of the aging Queen very proudly displaying her skin as part of a political game. One of the men to witness this strategy was the French ambassador, who saw the Queen some 7 years before she died. After one of their first meetings, he recorded with some shock that Elizabeth was strangely attired in a dress of silver gauze, as they call it. She kept the front of her dress open, and one could see the whole of her bosom and passing low. And often she would open the front of this robe with her hands as if she was too hot. Her bosom is somewhat wrinkled, as well as the collar that she wears around her neck, but lower down, her flesh is exceeding white and delicate, so far as one could see. So we could see this as a sign of vanity of an old woman who refuses to acknowledge her age. Or we can choose to read this as a more subtle and more difficult political message, a message to the ambassador's sovereign, the French King Henry. She might be signaling to him that her governmental self-confidence and command were not diminished even as her age progressed. So far we have seen two interpretations of royal elderliness. We have seen age being used as a negative in a negative political campaign in the case of Richard III, and we have seen a very realistic element in portraits which addressed the difficult issue of regal mortality. And I want to end my talk by speaking about a portrait which all of you will see and which symbolizes another approach. In this particular portrait, age is erased for the sake of conveying a more elevated, idealized message. When you enter the hall tonight to have dinner, you will be able to see the bust of Elizabeth on the right-hand side and a splendid full-length portrait on the main wall. Even though this portrait dates back to the 1590s, again, just like the previous portrait, this one fully exploits the possibilities of allegorization. Two angels glorify the Queen's head. She is dressed in a splendid gown, and her skin is smooth and ivory-like. To quote John Walsh, a historian and a fellow of this college, "This is Gloriana, eternally youthful, perpetually beautiful, virginal, at once Renaissance princess and classical deity." This is actually from an article he wrote about this particular portrait. The inscription in Latin, added later, celebrates her status as well as her patronage. It reads in translation, "The godlike Elizabeth, virgin unconquered, always majestic, with greater dignity than Caesar, etc., 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 of the immense ocean most providentially blessed conqueror of Jesus College the foundress." The cadence of the inscription makes us join in the celebration of the Queen, as we, the readers, instinctively await the climax, the final phrase in the inscription. And when we reach it, we realize that the glow of Her Majesty is used to elevate the status of this very college. So this is a very intricate system of double mirrors. The college displays a portrait of its foundress, who emanates splendor, which is cast back onto the college. So, as you're enjoying your dinner tonight, may I suggest that you look up and contemplate the message which this portrait is trying to convey. It invites you to enter a shared space, to join a story stretching between Elizabethan England and today. Thank you.